Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show.
In Bad Faith by Fencer X. Episode 1. The Pest Advisory Board had, Harry was certain, made some sort of dreadful mistake. You see, I'm a trainee Auror, he was explaining to the very unhelpful witch at reception in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Trainee, as in training? To become an Auror? With a DMLE? You don't say, the witch drawled, smacking loudly on a piece of Drubal's best. Yes, and so I don't think it's entirely appropriate, that is to say, I don't believe I'm all that qualified to handle this matter. He held up the interdepartmental memo that had jammed itself into his ear the moment he'd stepped into the lift this morning. It twitched pitifully, wrinkled and mussed after someone, certainly not Harry, had crumpled it up in a private moment of fury and frustration.
I'm sure one of the board members should be managing this, not a trainee Auror fresh from Hogwarts. Ain't you supposed to have graduated a year ago? She began blowing a bubble.
Well, technically, but you see, those of us involved in the war... He tapped his scar, not above hinting at his celebrity to get out of what was the stupidest, lowest, biggest waste of his time and mediocre talent, were allowed to finish up our studies that had been interrupted by the whole fleeing for our lives and fighting against dark wizards thing. So you got held back. Her Drubal's best bubble popped, releasing a spray of confetti that caked Harry's hair, glasses, and face. Swallowing enough oaths to fill 15 swear jars, he vanished the confetti and leaned over into the witch's space. This is so far outside my wheelhouse, I've changed time zones. Please. The witch began working on another bubble, plucking a file from a stack on her desk without looking and handing it to Harry. Doxies, Wiltshire. Hope you brushed up on your knockback jinx and remedial whatever. Have a nice day. Never in Harry's life had a day looked less likely to be nice. His heart had probably been lighter walking to his death. But he supposed this was part and parcel of being stuck on the lowest rung of the ladder. Trainees weren't even junior Aurors, who themselves weren't even senior Aurors. Technically, he wasn't even on the DMLE's payroll right now, mostly because he wasn't being paid at all. Instead, he was practically donating his very precious time to the ministry by being a glorified gopher, on temporary loan to just about anyone who needed an extra wand to handle matters the people who were actually trained to handle those matters didn't want to do. Like, for instance, de-doxying an infested manor owned by the pontiest twat this side of the Atlantic. He took small comfort as he made his way down to the disapparation zone that Malfoy Manor had evidently gone far enough to pot that doxies were moving in. Malfoy had once taken such pride in his high birth, and though Harry's irritation with the Git had tempered over the months since Voldemort's fall and the meting out of justice amongst Death Eaters, there would likely always be a tiny part of him that took dark glee in seeing Malfoy miserable. And Harry was all right with that character flaw. After all, Malfoy had gotten off pretty well once the dust had settled, all things considered, so Harry wasn't concerned with doling out too much sympathy on his account. Sure, his dad had gotten chucked back into Azkaban, deservedly so in Harry's opinion, but his mum had been pardoned on all accounts thanks to Harry's testimony, and last he'd seen in the Prophet, she'd skipped town for somewhere continental. The Malfoys probably had summer homes in 5 different countries, so she was likely living the high life and visiting Paris or Geneva or Rome or somewhere equally knobby. Malfoy himself had received a light sentence on account of his age, with stipulations he finish his Hogwarts studies and remain under house arrest for a full year thereafter. Harry thought it was more than he deserved, but the fate of the Malfoys was no longer his concern, so he kept his mouth shut about the Room of Hidden Things and decided that, between this and the 6th-year bathroom business, they were finally square. Yes, Harry could have happily gone the rest of his life never hearing the name Malfoy again, let alone interacting with the knob, but fate, it seemed, had different plans in store for them. So it was that Harry found himself standing on the front step of Malfoy Manor, wand tucked up his sleeve and bits of errant confetti still stuck in his hair, waiting patiently to be invited inside. The sooner he sorted out this doxy situation, they bit, and it hurt, that was about the sum total of information he'd retained on them from his Care of Magical Creatures class, with apologies to Hagrid, the sooner he could get back to the Ministry and start on his next thrilling assignment. Maybe he'd be mucking hippogriff pins. Maybe he'd have to chaperone the Japanese delegation. They always wanted to do karaoke. Maybe he'd get to sort items in the vanishing department. The possibilities were endless and all equally enticing. After several long, silent minutes passed with no response to his staccato rapping on the door, he palmed his wand and pressed the tip to his throat, prepared to announce his arrival the old-fashioned way, when there came the soft clicking of several locks being disengaged, and with a worrisome creak, the front door eased open. But there was no one there. At least, this was Harry's initial reaction, until he dropped his eyeline a couple of feet and met the watery, sunken eyes of a very, very old house elf. He might have been 2 feet tall standing straight up, but hunched forward into a stoop as he was, he barely reached Harry's knee. He glared up at Harry from under an overgrown bushy brow with that same pinch-faced expression all the Malfoys wore, as if they'd just smelled something rancid. Right. Of course Malfoy would send his most ancient house elf to answer the damn door instead of getting off his pimpled ass to do it himself. Harry felt a swell of pity for the poor creature, prompted by the fact that creature was a right treat to be around these days. Wizards didn't deserve the loyalty of these old elves, Malfoy more than any. Harry put on his best face. It wasn't the elf's fault Harry'd gotten stuck with such a rotten job, and if Malfoy Manor could turn out a gentle soul like Dobby, then surely this fellow couldn't be too— "'Bout time you showed up," the elf grunted, sneering at Harry in a fair rendition of Malfoy himself. And Harry panicked for a moment, convinced that this was not an elf but Draco fucking Malfoy, the happenstance victim of a horrific magical mishap. "The Master has been kept waiting many days, years. The Ministry is not being worth the bricks it's built out of, he is thinking." Well, that's not really my department," Harry hedged, wondering if this was Malfoy upbraiding him through the elf or the elf himself. "I only just got the notice about the job today, so—" "Too much talking, not enough dedoxying," the elf grumbled, shuffling around and impatiently waving Harry inside. "The Minister for Magic will be expecting a strongly worded owl from the Master." "Right. Yeah, I'll let him know." That swell of pity from before was dissipating rapidly, and Harry wondered if Dobby had been the exception rather than the rule. Thoughts of Dobby, though, immediately drew him back to the moment, and Harry recollected now that the last time he'd been here had been one of the darkest moments of the war. Hermione tortured at the end of Bellatrix's wand, Ollivander on his last legs in the dungeon, and brave, brave Dobby. There were far worse things lurking behind the walls of this place than Malfoy or magical pests, so Harry resolved to get these doxies sorted promptly and be on his way. Let Malfoy have his rotting, decrepit manor full of dark memories and half-dead house elves. Harry had a life to get back to living, and tarrying too long here couldn't be good for him. Still, his eye did roam as he allowed himself to be led through the long, dark hallways, past room after empty room, and it struck Harry here that the place seemed awfully, well, dead. It looked more like a showpiece, signs of recent renovation and restoration everywhere he looked, but no one there to live in it. He strained his ear to catch the sounds of Malfoy or any other occupants puttering about elsewhere as the elf led him deeper and deeper in, but there was nothing. Just the sound of Harry's trainer scuffing softly against the old hardwood floors and the occasional creaking groan of a board that needed mending. It looked somehow leagued better and so much worse than it had at the height of the war. A curious paradox in shades of mahogany and silver and emerald. "The doxy nest is being below. The Master is requesting a prompt resolution and then for leave to be taken." The elf gave only the curtest of bows before disapparating with a sharp crack, before Harry could ask where below was, because surely he couldn't be meant to go down into the fucking dungeon, right? But there was nowhere else below could mean but the bottom of the staircase that lay before him, leading into the yawning darkness and, Harry recalled, a fine, sturdy set of cells. That had been nearly 2 years ago, though, and he couldn't allow himself to be distracted from the job by encroaching memories. So he set his shoulders, nodded to himself, and marched downward, a Loomis to guide his way. The first thing he noticed was not the cells, nor was it the dank, musty smell of decay and disuse. The first thing he noticed was the portal. It wasn't terribly large as portals went. Granted, Harry hadn't really seen many portals in his time, or any portals in his time, so it was a difficult thing to rightly judge. Still, the word portal did leave one with some expectation of a bit of grandeur, and at roughly the size of a dinner plate, this one was less than impressive. What was impressive were the tiny creatures Harry could spot, now buzzing around the mouth of the portal. The eerie green light from the portal cast dancing shadows against the walls of the dungeon as the creatures flitted about, merrily chittering in a guttural language Harry couldn't hope to pass. He'd seen signs of mischief-makers on the long walk through the manor, a chandelier missing a few crystals, a moustache scrawled upon a painting of some distant Malfoy ancestor, curtains scorched with burn marks, and no candles about. And he'd assumed, well, doxies, or maybe pixies. At worst, a poltergeist that would need exorcising. These? No. These weren't even magical creatures, not by the standard definition at least. These were fucking demons. Minor ones, probably, seeing as they looked about the size of your standard fairy, but those were not doxies or pixies, and that was a goddamn portal to a plane no sane person had any business contacting. Bloody hell, indeed. Oh, Malfoy was in for it now. Harry was already numbering all statutes that had been violated in his head. He was getting into the double digits, because portals like this didn't generally pop up out of nowhere. They had to be scribed, purposefully. Malfoy might have slept through most of his Care of Magical Creatures class, but there was no way he'd mistake an imp for a doxy, which meant he'd either scribed the circle to create this portal himself, or knew who had. Either way, this was well outside the purview of the Pest Advisory Board, and that meant it was no longer Harry's problem. Time to kick it up the chain. He stomped back up the stairs, tromping down the hallway and bellowing at the top of his lungs, "Oi, Malfoy! Get your pasty ass down here and explain what the fuck's going on in your dungeon!" The old house elf apparated into being nearly right on top of his toes, and though Harry did not go sprawling arse over tea kettle, it was a near thing. "The Ministry Oath is to be keeping his voice down while the Master is abed. The Ministry Oath is going to hex the Master 6 ways to Sunday if he doesn't present himself by the count of 10. Go and fetch him now. He's in a world of trouble, and I'm sure he'll just be tripping over himself to explain what he's been up to." The elf's glower only darkened, and he seemed thoroughly disinclined to do anything Harry asked of him. Well, that suited Harry just fine. With a huff, he slipped around the elf and started for the grand staircase in the entryway, leading up to the east and west wings of the manor. He'd start with the west wing and work his way across until he found where Malfoy was holding himself up these days. Would it be his old bedroom, or would he have taken over the master suite, evidently being the master of the estate? Probably the latter, the pompous... Every muscle in Harry's body tensed up and froze. He could blink, and that was about it, so it was a good 30 seconds before the house elf managed to mount the stairs and enter his field of view, climbing a few steps up from Harry so that they were at eye level with one another. "The Ministry Oath will be remembering that he was tasked with dedoxing the dungeon and is not allowed elsewhere in the manor. Fucking house elf magic. Let me go, or I'll report the both of you. The Ministry Oath will be released once he gives his word to complete his task and then remove himself from the Master's property." Harry's jaw clenched. "Those aren't doxies, they're imps, and probably worse. So I need to speak with Malfoy." Old Burn is not hearing a yes. "About to hear a whole lot of something." Harry inhaled deeply, then roared with all his might, "Malfoy! Come call off your bloody elf, or so help me!" Old Burn then twitched his nose, and Harry's lips sealed shut, further protests locked inside. He continued to struggle against the body bind, but he no more understood house elf magic now than he had back during the war, so he could but squirm and rail against Old Burn impotently. His shouting, though, seemed to have done the trick, for only a few moments later, suddenly there was Malfoy, stood at the top of the staircase, rubbing his eyes sleepily and looking quite the sight. Harry realized, of course, that they hadn't seen one another in nearly 2 years, but he hadn't expected quite so shocking a transformation as appeared before him now. He was somehow taller and leaner, like he hadn't had a decent meal in the whole time since his hearing, and his hair hung lank and dull past his bum, far longer than it really ought to have been, even for 2 years' growth. The silk robe he wore, tied haphazardly at the waist and threatening to come undone at any given moment, suggested he'd just crawled out of bed at noon. But there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a prolonged lack of sleep. In short, he looked like shit, and Harry wondered if a portal to hellish realms in the basement wasn't Malfoy's biggest problem right about now. What on earth is making all that racket, old man? The house elf was immediately contrite.
Oh, old Burn is very much apologizing, Master. The Ministry Oath has insisted on making a nuisance of himself, but old Burn has him well under control. The Master may return to his rest.
That's Potter.
No, Master, this is the Ministry Oath.
Why is Harry Potter on my property?
The Ministry Oath is taking care of the Doxies, Master. He is not doing a very good job. Old Burn thinks Master will be needing to draft a missive of complaint.
I do love a good missive of complaint. Harry's eye bounced back and forth between Malfoy and old Burn, who seemed to be content to ignore Harry's plight entirely. They were now discussing whether to use the good quill to pin the missive of complaint, and Malfoy was steadily being bullied into breaking out a calligraphy set that had evidently been gifted to his family several years back by the Zabinis. He nodded around a yawn when old Burn suggested he fetch the set from the study in the East Wing, and Harry despaired he was about to toddle off back to Betty by, moaning plaintively from behind his fast-locked lips. Malfoy gave him a once-over, then waved his hand absently, and old Burn snapped his gnarled fingers, and Harry gasped deeply, panting as he collected himself.
Get your house elf under control.
Malfoy, he heaved. He is under control, aren't you, old Burn?
Old Burn is being a model elf, serving the Malfoy line for 7 generations and counting.
Very good, old Burn. Malfoy sighed, crossing his arms and causing the front flaps of the robe to gape a bit. Harry pretended not to see the silvery crisscrossing scars peeking out. Anything at all old Burn and I can do to make your visit more pleasant, Ministry Oath? Yeah. You could explain why the fuck you've got a portal leading to a pit full of demons in your dungeon. I'm certain I don't know what you're on about, Malfoy said, with the gall to sound bored. Old Burn, what is he babbling about?
The Ministry Oath is struggling with the Doxies, Master. Old Burn is thinking perhaps he's been bitten.
Nasty business, Doxy bites. He made a shooing gesture in Harry's direction. If you can't dispatch the creatures yourself, be them and run back to the Ministry and fetch me someone who can.
They aren't fucking Doxies, you dolt! They're imps! Lesser demons, and you're in for a world of trouble once the Ministry finds out you've been dabbling in summoning.
Yes. He yawned again, expression twisting, and began climbing the stairs once more, one hand resting on the banister as he seemed unsteady on his feet. Old Burn will see you out. Harry frowned, even as he felt the feeling return to his limbs as the body bind was lifted, and old Burn began once more shooing him back down the stairs, this time toward the front entrance. Malfoy was cocky, but he wasn't stupid. At least not that stupid. He was shrewd. He had to know how illegal it was to attempt a summoning ritual without proper authority, and he wouldn't have so lackadaisically invited Harry into his home with the evidence of his poor choices there in plain view. And more to the point, he certainly wouldn't have just turned Harry out, blithely allowing him to fuck off back to the Ministry to report the curious goings-on at Malfoy Manor to the proper authorities. So either Malfoy was up to something nefarious, and Harry could already hear Hermione and Ron rolling their eyes and muttering, "Again? Honestly, Harry? Oh. Burn, hey, I've had a change of heart. I'd really like another go at those Doxies. Seeing every job through to its end is a matter of personal pride for me, and I'd hate to run back to the Ministry and beg them to send someone else to handle a task I wasn't up to." Old Burn continued poking at him with knobby, clawed fingers, directing him towards the front door. Honestly, it's a pretty nasty infestation, and I worry for the Master's health if it's allowed to continue unaddressed. I mean, look how long it took for them to send me out here. It could be weeks before someone else gets dispatched. The poking finally stopped, and Harry peeked over his shoulder. Old Burn was giving him an appraising glare.
Old Burn is not trusting the Ministry Oath any farther than he can throw him.
You're no treat either. He sank down into a crouch. But you and I both know those aren't doxies, and your Master's not in his right mind because of it. So do you want to help him, or do you want to let those imps continue to leech off him? Wizard's magic bolsters their life force, so it won't be quick, but it also won't be pretty. Ready for those 7 generations of servitude to stop here? I honestly wouldn't blame you. The elf's beady-eyed glare sharpened, and at length he grunted.
The Ministry Oath will stay and dedoxy the manor as ordered.
There's a good lad. It'll be a job and a half, that's for certain, but it shouldn't take more than...
And he will not leave the premises until the task is complete and the Master is restored to his right mind.
Few days, maybe... What? And Old Burn, for the first time, smiled.